what exactly the JDBC and how it is being implemented by Spring framework. Already we know that the Spring is itself, it is having a dependency injection, and let us see how the dependency injection useful in implementing JDBC concept. So before that, let us see what exactly the JDBC API is providing and why we are using JDBC. Right. You can see to access the data from the database, we use the JDBC concept. As we know that the Java provides JDBC API in order to perform the data access from the database. So this is simple concept. But when you are using Spring framework in order to access the data, we have some different infrastructure to access the data from the database. Now let us have a simple overview of normal JDBC API. How does generally we need to use a JDBC API kind of things. You see, as everyone knows that the JDBC API uses the implemented classes and interfaces which are used to interact with the relational database management system. So generally, if you come with JDBC API, there are JDBC drivers are provided by the vendors which are useful to communicate with the databases. There are many database drivers based on the databases which we are going to use in our normal applications. So how does the JDBC driver is being used in our application? How can we access the database drivers? So the database vendors will provide some jar files which are having predefined classes and interfaces. So those jar files we have to attach with our application in the form of class path. So that's why we are able to access the concerning jar files and concerning JDBC API facilities. That's a common thing in normal application, we have to do it. So based on the database and based on the versions of the database, there are many jar files are available by the vendors. Let us see here. You can see the classes 12.jar is a jar file which is used for Oracle 8 and 9i versions. Similarly, if you are going to use the Oracle 10G version, so we have to use the OJDBC 14.jar, that is another jar file. Suppose you are going to use MySQL database, there is a different jar file will be provided by the database vendor. But we have to make sure that the jar file has to be attached to the application in order to use the facilities of the JDBC API. So after that, generally we know what are the various steps we have to perform in order to access the database layers. You see, the first thing, as we already know that the registering the database JDBC drivers, there are various drivers like type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4 architectures. Based on that architecture, which type of driver you are going to use, we have to register the driver along with our Java application. So generally, we use the type 4 driver. We use the type 4 driver which is useful for developing web application as well as desktop application, which is the latest one. So we need to register the driver first. Then later, we have to obtain the connection based on the driver you have set in the Java code. After that, in order to send the queries between the database and Java, we need to create statements. The fourth step, after you creating a statement as per your requirement, we need to execute the statements in order to get the proper results from the database. These are the main 4 steps we have to perform for every JDBC related code in our Java application. So here what exactly I want to tell you is these all things we have to write our own, each and every syntaxes we have to follow and write the code to obtain the proper data from the database. And based on the SQL statements, we have different types of statements like getting the query and inserting data and deleting the data. So these are the different data types. We have different the queries we have to execute, and after that we can get the detail from the data from the database. At the end, we have to make sure that we must close the connection which is already be opened in the beginning. So these each and every step we have to perform our own by writing a specific syntaxes in normal JDBC API. So to overcome this problem, we can go through the Spring framework. We can directly take the help of Spring framework. As we know that the framework is used to as an upper layer for the existing code. So it will help us by reducing the writing a boilerplate code. It will also provide an upper layer which will simply simplify our code writing process by providing the predefined set of methods and classes. See, these are the simple steps we will generally perform in JDBC API while coding the normal Java application. So because you can see here each and every step is clearly written as registering driver. So whatever the type of driver we are going to use, we have to specify in the class dot for name method, okay, which will register the driver with our driver manager, which will take care of the connection establishment. Then later we have to create a statement in order to write the statements. Like if you want to write the queries, we need to write an insertion command. We need to get the values from the database, we need to write the select statements. And before that, you have to see that the connection has established or not. So for the connection, generally what we have to do, by using a predefined method, get connection of the driver manager class, we have to specify the URL of the database. Like we already see here, you can see on the screen, the JDBC Oracle thin. Thin is nothing but it's a type 4 indication of the driver. The driver, type 4 driver is called as a thin driver, which is useful to develop web application, which is pure Java driver, which is known as pure Java driver, which directly communicates with to the net protocols. It will not use the help of any of the middle tier architectures. Like if you go for type 1 driver, it uses JDBC ODBC driver. So JDBC ODBC is nothing but it uses a middle tier called open database connectivity, and it will communicate with the native protocols. So it will simply reduce the increase the burden and increase the time of the program execution, because two-layer conversion will be there when you are using ODBC driver, because the Java calls has to convert into ODBC calls, then ODBC calls has to convert into JDBC calls. That is that simple two-layer conversion we have to perform. Because of that reason, the program execution will be more slower. So for that reason, we go and use the type 4 driver, which is directly communicating with the network protocol instead of going to any of the middle layer architecture. You see, based on our requirement, we have different statements we have to prepare, and as per your requirement, we have to use the different methods available in JDBC API, like execute query. The execute query is used for selecting the commands from the database, selecting the values from the database, and retrieving the values in the form of a result set object. And execute update is a method which is used for normal DDL and DML type of commands. So DDL, DML is nothing but data definition language and data manipulation language. Like inserting values, updating values into the database, and creating database tables such as different operations you can perform using normal execute update method. Similarly, other method is their execute method, which can perform both operations. You can either perform DDL commands or you can perform DML commands, as well as you can get the query using the execute statement. So likewise, we have many methods and predefined classes available in the normal JDBC API. Now, so this is the normal common JDBC API which we have to write each and every statement, and we are performing the code, and we have to make sure while writing this the exception handling is mandatory. Everywhere we have to handle our exceptions, like SQL exception, class not found exception, we have to write. You can see in this code a basic query example of normal JDBC. See here the statement, you can see the throws exception. What does it mean? Throws SQL exception means this program must handle the SQL exception. Means it's a responsibility of the programmer to make sure that he has to handle the SQL exception. Similarly, there are many things you can see in this code that when you open the connection and you open the result set, so those things you have to statement, including all these things, we have to close at the end of the program. So this is all of these things are the responsibility of the programmer to close the resources which we already open. So exception handling and closing resources, many more. So each and every step it has to be performed by the programmer only. So that is the reason we can directly go through the Spring framework, which will take care of these things itself, and it makes easy to the programmer. Yeah, what are the packages are being used for Spring to handle the JDBC? So these are the main packages you can see. One is core and data source, object, support. So these are the 4 packages are available in the Spring framework in order to maintain the JDBC access. So each will take care of each activity. Like you can see here, the core module, the core will take care like SQL exception translator. Means the main advantage if you want to discuss about the SQL using in Spring is the exception handling will be automatically taken care by the Spring framework. So the exception handling process need not to be handled by the programmer. The one. The second thing is many methods which we are explicitly writing, and as well as the connection creation, creating statements. So these are the things which we doesn't require to do explicitly, which will be taken care by the Spring framework. So that is the main advantage we can get by using the Spring framework, right? So let us see how the Spring will take care of all these things using the predefined packages. So you can see here the core package will take care about the SQL exception translator, which will translate the unchecked exception, checked exception into unchecked exceptions. As we know that if you have any checked exceptions, then it is mandatory to handle the exceptions by the programmer. And if unchecked exceptions, it is not mandatory to handle by the programmer. As we know that if you are handling the exception, that means we need to write the throws keyword, either we have to write the try keyword. Without that, running the code is not possible because the compiler does not allow to compile the code without handling the exception. That's why we have to take care of the exception handling concept also. And the other thing is, you can see here, the JDBC template will provide the JDBC template, which is available in the Spring also, which will provide a predefined methodologies, predefined functionalities, and it will also take care of connection creation, preparing statement, everything. So by this, we can get lot of benefits of using Spring framework. And data source is the main concept, and it is the main package which will take care of establishing connections. As we know that if you want to connect with any database, it is mandatory that we need to specify, we need to inform about the database URLs and database class drivers and everything we have to give, even including the username and password. So each and everything, if you see the previous program, whatever we have seen, you can see here, we specified each and everything, like you can see the URL for the connection, like JDBC colon Oracle colon thin, and this is the database name at my host, like the system name where the server is located. What does it mean? Where the server is located, Oracle server is located. And JDBC colon Oracle are the application protocols, and thin is a data driver name. And as you can see, every server is connected to a particular port. Without port, there is no server, because in a system, we can locate a system by using its IP, like we already given at my host. In that system, where it has to communicate, how can we recognize? That is only possible by using the port number. The port number 1521 is a Oracle port number. So in the system at my host, and we are saying that 1521 is a port number to which we have to communicate. Likewise, we have to specify each and every information of the database while communicating to the database. Like Scott and Tiger is a password and username and password. So each and everything we have to specify, because we know that where to communicate. So we have to give the information. After that, we can ask to establish the connection. Similarly, you can see the data source also read the related information in order to provide the connection. See, this is the simple a bean. This is a simple a bean which uses to establish the connection using a data source of Spring framework. As we know that Spring framework is used by the bean factory. The bean factory, which will take care of creating beans, creating objects in the Spring framework environment. So how does this bean factory will do each and everything? So we have to tell the bean factory what to do and how to do. So which is the way to inform bean factory? How can we establish the connection and each and everything? So as we know that for the bean factory, you can simply inform by specifying all the configurations in a XML file, that is spring.xml file, which will define the predefined tags. Through that, you can give the message that which database we have to communicate and which type of drivers we are going to use. Such kind of things we have to inform. So in order to do that, you can see the predefined classes which we already used in a normal Java API. We have to specify all of them and all the information to the bean factory in order to establish the connection to the database. As you know that in Spring framework, when you are creating a bean for a particular class, we have to specify the properties. You can see the data source is a property for the driver manager data source class, which is a predefined Spring data source class, which will take care of establishing a connection. Like you can see, how does it establish a connection? So we have to inform each and every property. We have to specify here The property you can see, the first property, the driver class name. As we already seen in the previous Java API, JDBC API, we have to specify the driver class name. Similarly, we have to fill the driver class name of the driver manager data source class with the particular database driver class name. You can see I have specified sun.jdbc.odbc.jdbc driver. What does it mean? It's a driver class located in a packages called sun.jdbc.odbc. So we are simply specifying the class name, the driver class name to which we are going to use for establishing a connection. So in this way, you can specify the driver class and you can inform the bean factory that I am going to use this particular driver to establish the connection. The second thing you can see, the second property is nothing but URL property. The URL is nothing but what, where exactly the database is located and what is the database name we are going to use. So that is we are specifying in the URL property. The latter you can see in the database where we have to connect. I mean to say which username and password. That is the main concept we have to perform. So username is what, Scott I am going to use, and the password is a tiger. So this all information we have to specify in order to create a data source. So the data source is an class ID which is take care of establishing a connection. And see, there is a DAO class, data access object class. This is an implementation class and this is a interface for the DAO. And in the implementation class, you see, as we already know that in the Spring framework, if you want to perform injection of control means what? Dependency injection. So here, what is the dependency for my implementation class? I need in this implementation class the data source. I need the data source. The DAO is required the data source object. So what we'll do, if you want to inject the data source which we created through XML, this data source we have to specify here as a private variable. We need to create a private variable for the data source to which we are going to establish the connection. Right. So automatically what happens when you write the data source and its setter and getter methods, and automatically the bean factory will inject the data source into our setter method. You can see the setter method is used to receive the data source object from the Spring Bean factory, and it is injecting the value to the current property data source. So that means this data connection implement class, which presently on the screen, is automatically got the data source object. And as well as whenever the other service classes are requesting for this data source, it's simply returning the data source by using the data source dbcon method. So this is the way how we can establishing connection to the database. It's a normal database connection using the Spring framework. And you can see the other configuration like DS, the data connection implemented. Exactly, we are using the setter method and we created a private data source object. So how the Spring knows that I have to inject the object into the data source in the particular class, data connection implementation. So in order to inform the Bean factory that I am expecting some object into the data source in this class, I have to enclose one more. The configuration you can see, I specified one more Bean ID like DS. You can see it's a common logical name which we can use anything here. It is not mandatory that you go through the DS, right? And you must specify the class name which in which we are going to inject the value of data source. So this is the spr1.data connection implementation class we already gone through. In that class, what is the property? The property name is data source. We already written here. The data source is the property you can see on the screen to which we are going to inject the value. that we have to specify. Then using these configurations, the bean factory will inject the data source object into our implementation class. By using that the data source in the implementation class, you can perform the JDBC activities. Okay, this is a normal thing, but here there is another advantage of using Spring is you can also use JDBC template class. The JDBC template class is providing additional benefits over the normal connection. So it will take care, because of this JDBC template class, it will take care everything like establishing connection and handling exception. So these kind of things we can perform. Let us see how can we implement the JDBC class, JDBC template. See, it's a normal configuration we are performing in the Spring framework. That XML bean factory is equals to new XML bean factory, new class path resource XML. So what does it mean? What we are exactly trying to do here? So guys, you can see here, whatever the configuration file I have prepared earlier, I am informing the bean factory that you have to go through this XML, which I specified all my configurations. While I am creating bean factory, I have to specify the XML name. So which I am doing here, XML factory, bean factory. And I am creating an object name like fact is equals to new XML bean factory. Why only I am using XML bean factory class? Because it is one of the implemented class for the bean factory, which is created by using the XML configurations. So that's why when I'm specifying the XML configuration file, so I have to use the class, I have to create the object for the XML bean factory. And the reference of this I have to store in the bean factory. Likewise, I have created bean factory object. Then later you can see I'm requesting the bean factory object by specifying an ID called DS, by which I can get the bean from the Spring factory. So when you specify DS, it will go and search in the dscon.xml for the DS, which is an ID which we specified here. You can see what is a DS. DS means we are simply getting the data source. So how we are getting the data source? The data source is an object which is already predefined data source injected by the another class. So here we are preparing one data source. In the left side you can see by giving all the configurations of the database connection. After that, it will inject this data source object into the database connection implementation class. So how it is possible? Because of this reason I am getting. You see, I am requesting DS so that the data source also will be injected into the JDBC template demo class. So that configuration we specified in the XML automatically will get in the JDBC template demo class. So after that, what I am doing is I am typecasting into data connection. Whatever the data connection is coming from the bean factory, I am typecasting into data connection. And later I am storing into DSR is a variable belongs to data connection. Now, what I can do, see, when you have an object for the class, see, this is the class which we have. By that class, I can get the data source object into the current class. You can see there is a method called dbcon, which is simply returning the current data source which it got from the bean factory. So it already has the data source completely, and that if you want, you can call this method. By this method, you can receive the value anywhere. And you can see I'm simply calling dsr.dbcon. So what happens? It will retrieve one object of data source to me that I am storing in the variable called ds belongs to data source reference. So by using ds, what I can do here, the intention of getting DS is I want to create a JDBC template class. I want to see what I can do with a JDBC template. So when you want to work with a JDBC template, you have to get the data source, because the JDBC template needs a database and it has to know from where exactly I have to get the data. That's why I first got the data source. Then I'm creating JDBC template class object and passing the data source object to the JDBC template. Now the JDBC template object is ready. That is JT, by which I can insert the data, I can delete the data, I can update the data, I can whatever I want, I can do it. You see, I'm simply using the predefined methods of JDBC template here. JT.execute. What does it mean? JT.execute, as I told you previously, the execute method can be used to perform any operation. Here you can see JT is a JDBC template providing a method called execute, as well as where I'm inserting values into a particular table called product. I'm writing a query into the JT.execute. So what happens, you can see in this program how it is very simple. I no need to worry about the creation of the object, of the connection, establishment. I no need to go for even closing of connection. I no need to bother about anything. So that is the advantage I'm getting here. Simply, if you want to work with the JDBC template, the thing is you have to get the data source from anywhere. That we already requested to the Spring container, which has given the data source by reading the XML file configurations which we specified. And after that, I'm executing the method execute and just simply insert into the product and setting the values. See guys, not only insertion, you can also perform the retrieval of the object using the JDBC template. The JDBC template also provides a method here, that query for int. There are several methods are provided by the JDBC template by which you can perform various operations. Here also you can see the same thing I am going to perform, like creating bin factory by specifying the XML to it, so that the bin factory will read the XML for each and every configuration and it will perform the task for me. And requesting the data source. So every time when you want to work with a JDBC template, you have to request for the data source object, and the data source object you inject into the JDBC template while you are creating the JDBC template. Then the JT is ready for me again. The JDBC template I have created through the Spring container. Now you can see JT.query for int, where I am simply giving select command. As you know that the select command retrieves data from the database. So here what I am doing is, instead of hard coding the values directly, I am specifying a placeholder question mark. You know what about the question mark? So the value I can specify later. I no need to specify in the query itself. That you can see here, I'm creating a new object which is a generic object of the Java, and I'm specifying the name of the PNM. It's a product name. PNM is nothing but it's a product name. So select the price from the product whose price name is equals to, where PNM is equals to is nothing but what, whose price name is equals to. So question mark. So instead of giving value, I can specify the question mark. Then later I can replace the question mark with a specific value. That I am doing here. So that I am giving mouse as a PNM. Mouse is a PNM. So you can put it here and you can get the query by selecting command. As you know that generally when you get the query, what happens? It generates a result set. But here you can see, instead of getting the result set, I am getting the only integer value. Why I am getting integer value? Because You see, if you are getting all the row, all the columns and all the rows of the table, it has to go to a specific object, like similar, which is similar to storing the values in the memory. So the object which is called as a result set object, which stores the data coming from the database table in the form of result set. Result set is nothing but which also stores the values in the form of rows and columns. But here, if you see this query, is a normal statement which is retrieving only the price of a product. The price is nothing but what? It can be integer, it can be float. So in our case, you can see the query I have prepared, it is based on integer retrieval. So when it is retrieving an integer, obviously I have to receive an integer and store into the variable. And you can see I am receiving in the mouse price, which is an integer. After the JDBC template executes its query, it will retrieve the retrieved value into the mouse price at the left of the variable. Then after that, I am simply printing the value to the screen. In that way, you are going to use the JDBC template. So JDBC template is another advantage in the Spring, where we no need to bother about any kind of things, like as I told you that we no need to bother about any exception handling things. We no need to worry about opening connections and creating statements. We no need even for closing connections. So which will automatically taken care by the Spring framework. That is the main advantage why we should go for the Spring framework. So this is the main advantage of using JDBC template over the Spring framework. You can see more examples here. We can use many different queries in the JDBC template. You can perform updation and you can perform deletion, you can perform insertion. So anything you want to do as a normal JDBC code you can do. But the thing is, you no need to worry about the connections, you no need to worry about the exception handlings, such kind of things. So everything is taken care by the Spring container and JDBC template. So that is the simple concept of JDBC using Spring, where we are getting many advantages. See here, one more thing I want to make you clear that I already discussed about type 4 driver of the JDBC, but here we specified sun.jdbc.odbc. So exactly, it is not exactly matching to the URL which I have shown earlier. Like I said, thin, but this is a different case and you can use here. This is a type 1 driver which is using the sun specified JDBC ODBC driver. That's why we are just simply specifying JDBC colon ODBC and then test. What does it mean? The test represents a database name. Sorry, ODBC name. The DSN, which is called as data source of the ODBC. But if you are using a type 4, the different name has to be specified. Yeah, you can see here when I'm using the Oracle JDBC Oracle driver. So you can use this driver instead of the sun.jdbc ODBC driver. So this is a type 4 and latest driver which will take care of all the communication establishment directly to the net protocol, which does not depend on any other middle tier, as I told you that. And you can see the URL Why? If you observe the URL here, JDBC colon Oracle colon thin, and even I'm specifying each and every location environment. Like I'm giving the server name, I'm giving the port name, I'm giving the server ID, that is ORCL, everything. When you see that, when I'm specifying here, it's a type 1 driver. So when you are using type 1 driver, we no need to specify that much details which are we specifying for the type 4 driver. You can see the URL for the type 1, the JDBC colon ODBC colon test. What does it mean? Simply we are giving the three values. So we are not specifying any server name, we are not specifying any port name. What does it mean? Why we are not doing this? Because you see, when you are taking the help of someone, you no need to specify each and everything. That is clear. If you are taking the help of someone to do some job, simply you tell about the job instead of giving all information, because he is already aware. But when you are taking your responsibility to do each and everything yourself, you no need to, you have to give each and everything, and you have to do each and everything yourself instead of depending on others. The same thing applies here. The Typhon, the driver, which is prepared by some microsystem, and it is using the ODBC, Open Database Connectivity driver. So it simply gives its jobs to the ODBC. ODBC will take care each and everything, how to connect and where to communicate, where to go. But in case of type 4, you can see guys, it will take care of everything itself, where we are not depending on any of the different databases. Like JDBC colon Oracle. In the type 4, we will take care each and everything. So we have to specify the server name and port number, each and everything. So because of that reason, you can see the URL is so lengthy here. Shaking. Sorry guys for interruption. And this is the main reason why we have specified the lengthy URL in order to use the type 4 drive. Okay guys, so this is a Spring JDBC concept, how the Spring is providing easy environment for us to do the JDBC establishment and database access kind of things.
Stop.